So this is the presentation on the first demand point of the Extinction Rebellion Netherlands demands. It's on the concept of telling the truth, and also especially with the big focus on the concept of the ecological emergency. Right from the beginning, I want to caution a bit that to perceive this presentation more as a comment and not so much as an objective presentation, because the topic is quite difficult and quite, let's say, subjective. So to start with, I want to look at how the demands, this first demand, is formulated in different countries, starting with the Netherlands. I'm not going to read out all of them, so maybe just stop the video if it goes too quickly and just take some time to read the demands. So this is the current formulation here in the Netherlands, with the English version on the top and the Dutch version on the bottom. And this is the version that is used in a lot of different countries with slight adaptations. So this formulation appears in the demands of a lot of different countries. So I'm just going to read out. The government must tell the truth about how deadly our situation is. Then the UK and Switzerland and some other countries in slightly adapted forms put in by declaring a climate and ecological emergency. It must reverse all policies not in alignment with that position, and must work alongside the media to communicate the urgency for change, including what individuals and communities and sometimes businesses need to do. Germany, Canada, and Australia leave out the concept of the emergency in this case. And especially for Germany, I will talk later about why that probably is the case. So these are the formulations in 4 other countries. Belgium doesn't mention the part of telling the truth, but immediately demands from the government to declare a climate and ecological emergency. France has a very different formulation that is not really connected to this formulation that appears in a lot of countries. So if you speak French, best is if you look at the French original version. The US has a quite interesting formulation combining this aspect of telling the truth with the ecological emergency by saying that the government has to tell the truth about the climate and wider ecological emergency, which is a slight twist, but that actually gives quite a different meaning to it. And then the UK changed the demands recently to a shorter version, and it says government must tell the truth by declaring a climate and ecological emergency, working with other institutions to communicate the urgency for change. So the main point that I see now that I want to emphasize here is that this communication aspect towards society is carried out by other institutions and not just the media. So some points that kind of are relevant in this demand point then, based on these different demands that we saw, is the truthful communication of the threats that we are exposed to. Then in connection to that, the communication on how stakeholders can get active, so the participation aspect. Then sometimes the demand for certain legal actions, so for example, the abolishment of contrary policies, especially in the Dutch demands and the current ones, the part of educating society or parts of society. In the Dutch demand specifically, it is mentioned that the act of telling the truth needs to be embedded in the education system. And then the aspect of the climate and ecological emergency. And now for the rest of the presentation, I want to mainly focus on that. Again, short disclaimer, kind of to make you aware that this is really a comment. I just want to briefly talk about my background so that you can also look at my presentation from that perspective. Because I just finished my bachelor, so I don't have a very high academic level, and I have a bachelor in political sciences and did some studies on emergencies in comparative constitutional law. So I have a little bit of knowledge about the legal side of emergencies. So keep this in mind while looking to the presentation, watching it. So for the first section, I mainly want to look at one proponent of the idea of a climate emergency movement, which is Margaret Klein Salomon. She's the leader of the climate mobilization think tank, and she's really a big advocate of putting the narrative of the emergency and the whole practice of it at the center of the climate movement. So I talk about the history of this because it's now going on for like around 15 years that emergency narratives are used in the climate movement, but also I want to talk about the theory of change. So what is the concept that people like Salomon have of how to create change through the use of the emergency narrative. So the first point is that Salomon argues that a lot of, for example, big green NGOs advocate for a, let's say, optimism narrative, not mentioning the real threats, not creating fears among the population by talking about the real threats of climate breakdown and ecological collapse. And Salomon argues that this is wrong, that this comes from a wrong perception of what the reaction of people is to threats. She says that big green NGOs have the worry that they create panic or apathy. So either like an overreaction or a complete rejection of what's going on in reality when they talk about the climate emergency or climate crisis. Well, Salomon says that there's a third different way of how people can respond to big threats, which is an emergency mode. That is not the same as panic or apathy. That's important. Again, what's important to know is that Salomon comes from a psychology perspective. So many people know maybe emergencies more from the political context of states of emergency and states in countries or in like regions like the EU. But Salomon starts her argumentation really from the psychological perspective. So how does an individual react to emergencies, or from group psychology? So how do small groups, especially also in evolutionary terms, like throughout the centuries, learn how to react to emergencies? And she defines a couple of characteristics of how it looks like when people or small groups respond to emergencies in an emergency mode. The first one is that people readjust their priorities. So in the normal state, people have different priorities, let's say success, happiness, good relations, and they balance these out. They make decisions of which one to prioritize. This is the normal state. When people go into an emergency mode, they have one priority, survival, or the solving of that particular emergency or problem. That becomes the highest priority. So they are different, like the normal state and the emergency state differ. In emergency mode, people or groups mobilize new resources. They have more energy. They are able to mobilize resources that they normally don't have access to. Collective action plays an important role. So, or what she calls also the hive mode, in reference to bees. Where in an emergency situation, the goal of an individual is not self-fulfillment, but serving the collective. And she basically argues there from an evolutionary psychology perspective and says that groups in which the individuals are able to switch into this hive mode had a better chance of surviving compared to other groups. And this is why humans that lived in groups have developed this capacity to be in a normal mode most of the time, but also switch into this hive mode in situations when the group is under big stress. An important part is also that in emergency situations, we are laser focused. She uses this term, but she also uses the word rational. It is in an emergency mode, we make rational decisions. We look at the conditions that we have and at the resources that we have and make the best possible decisions on how to allocate our resources for problem solving. And then a concept that she uses in reference to another scholar is the flow state, where she basically refers to something that many of us have experienced, a state of heightened capacities, of high focus, nearly a way of being like thrilled when we're in emergency situations. I personally know this from sports situations, but you might know it from exams, when you enter exams, when you maybe have been in an accident and you just feel that you know what you have to do. The examples that she used, and also when we think about emergencies, are often short-term emergencies, like what I said, car accidents, or the famous example of the burning house. But Salomon also points out that there are also long emergencies, like chronic diseases, poverty, or prolonged war, in which people and groups are able to switch on and off this emergency mode. and are actually through this able to keep a long-term emergency mode going over years and years. And this happens. This is normal. People who have experienced these situations as above know that this is possible, that they can be in an emergency mode in many situations when they, for example, need to make sure when they're under poverty that they find shelter, that they find food, but that they are still able to also have normal conversations, normal relations from time to time. A term and like an idea that is often used in the climate mobilization, climate emergency movement is this comparison to World War II scale climate mobilization. And Solomon, as a US citizen, refers to the situation of when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and basically triggered the hive switch. So triggered this moment when the US collectively switched from a normal mode into emergency mode. So looking basically at the concepts that we had before, that suddenly the whole US economy was directed towards solving the problem, mobilization of resources, car factories, other big industries were suddenly directed towards producing war products like tanks, ammunition. The production of the economy increased intensely. For example, there were goals set for the production of airplanes, and these goals were by far exceeded, and the economy managed to produce much more than these already really ambitious goals that were set in the beginning of war mobilization. And there was a broad participation. All kinds of groups in society contributed their share, and in Solomon's argument, even their fair share, so that we, for example, had in the last years of the wartime, that we had a 94% high income tax on the groups in society that earned the most. The whole process was shaped by a lot of participation, but it was publicly coordinated by the government, which again refers also to this rational part that Solomon argues for in the individual context, that in an emergency situations, decisions are made in a rational manner. It's not just everyone works somehow, but there's some kind of coordination, there's some kind of rationale behind actions that are taken. How does this war mobilization relate to the ecological emergency? And there Solomon is very clear that the ecological emergency obviously differs in a lot of ways from situations like war or like a superstorm, let's say, that hits the coastline. Obviously, we can see that this emergency mode hasn't been triggered yet in society. And this is for several reasons. For example, that the threats are perceived as long-term. So Solomon then gives three reasons why this emergency mode hasn't been triggered yet, and derives from this also three ways how social movements have to act in order to bring society into emergency mode. The first one is social proof, where Solomon shows that when people around you are not in emergency mode, you also think that there's no necessity to be in an emergency mode. And there she shows that it's important that environmental movements especially, lead by examples. The people who are in the environmental movements already have to act as if it is an emergency. This is crucial to kind of trigger this social proof thing where people look around and see, okay, more and more people around me are in an emergency mode, so I better switch as well. The second one is gradualism, which relates very much to the first concept, where she basically, again, refers to big NGOs, but also to other movements that advocate a gradual, efficient way of dealing with the climate change situation then. And there she says that movements have to move the movement. So that movements actually not just have to engage with governments and broader society, but that the climate emergency movement has to engage with other movements that promote gradualism and criticize them and push them to switch into emergency mode too. This relates very much to the social proof thing, because especially if those who advocate for action on climate change promote a gradual change, this proves to broader society that emergency responses are not necessary. So move the movement is an important concept. And the third reason why people don't necessarily switch into emergency mode is helplessness. It's not enough if people understand that there's a crisis situation. They also have to see a way out. If people think that there's no way out, it only creates apathy or fatalism. So movements also have to provide ideas and visions, hopefulness for a way out of the situation. In the words of Naomi Klein's book, no is not enough. It is not enough to just criticize the moment and point out in what crisis we are. We have to offer alternatives. So now I want to look into risks and criticisms of the emergency narrative. This now goes beyond Salomon's article and is very much based on individual, like my own experience, but also on articles that I will link later in the video. And I think it is important for us as a movement to be aware of this criticism. Like, this doesn't necessarily have to keep us from using emergency narratives, but in the formulations that we choose, in the demands that we now write, but also in our broader communication, for example, in the FAQs, but also when people ask us questions in media communication, we need to be aware of these criticisms, on these risks, on these limitations of the emergency narrative, to be able also to respond to it in a good way. So the first point is that emergency situations often come along with suspension of individual rights. In the war situation, for example, in the US or in the UK, and also many other countries, states of emergencies often lead to the suspension of individual rights, in the sense that we have war trials that function differently than normal courts. We have restrictions on consumptions, restrictions on free traveling, restrictions on other types of freedom. For example, people have to participate in the army. So this is something that we have to be aware. The allocation, the mobilization comes along with restrictions of individual rights in many types of emergencies. Again, not to say that this has to be the case in the environmental emergency, but this is a connotation that often comes along with the emergency narrative. Emergencies hide the political nature of decisions. Angela Merkel, for example, in the financial crisis 2008, 2009, often spoke of alternativlose Politik, politics that is without alternatives, which is a paradox, because politics is all about alternatives and the discussion of different interests that then leads to a collective decision. An example for this is in 2008, 2009, the emergency budget that the UK decided on, where the government proposed an emergency budget and basically said, we need to have this budget to solve the problem, and everyone who dissents with this is against the collective good. So this policy, this particular budget, is without an alternative, which is never the case. Every decision is political in nature. The third one is undermining of democratic processes, which is very much connected to this, but I just want to show that in several cases where emergency narratives have been used by governments, by politicians, democratic processes such as consultation times were shortened and centralized decision-making was promoted. Another point is that emergencies are temporary in nature. Even if they last long, you can define when the emergency is over. Let's say with a disease, you can say, okay, when the disease is treated, you know that it is over. With the climate ecological emergency, we as a movement also, and as individuals, we have to know how do we define the end of this emergency situation and say that we can go into, that the society can go into the normal state again. Maybe this is not the most important question right now because we are in an emergency situation, in a very pressing situation, but we need to be aware of this point of criticism. The temporary can become the permanent. Emergency legislations, emergency responses are supposed to be restorative in nature. This is at least how we are used to it as a society. Let's say we are used to emergencies that are external, like war or natural catastrophes that hit our society. And then we switch into emergency mode to recreate the normal conditions under which we can make normal decisions again. The climate and the ecological emergency, however, is different because it is created by our political and our economic system. The political part, this is shown in more detail also in the Citizens' Assembly talk. So the response that we need to make against this emergency actually is by definition going to change this political and economic system. So the response that we have to this immediate threat right now will create new conditions, political and economic conditions, that will last for decades. To give a concrete example, to bring down the emissions of the transport sector, we now have to make decisions on how we want to organize the transport sector. Do we want to have public transport? Do we want to have sustainable fuels, for example? And all these decisions will shape society for many decades, and therefore are very political by nature, which is very different than a war situation where you say, okay, we now have to produce a lot of tanks, but after the war situation, these factories can go back to their normal situation and producing cars again. Then another point is that in the last decades, and actually in the last century, the emergency language was more and more abused and overused by politicians and by social movements. These groups know very well that using the emergency language has a lot of appeal, because it basically says, people around me, stop the discussion. We need to find a solution now, and I have this solution. And then the solutions that were offered, you have to ask yourself if they are actually in the interest of the society, or if they're in the interest of the person who promotes the emergency solution. An example of this is that after the financial crisis, politicians in the EU, like Barroso, promoted emergency responses in their language to the financial crisis. And these emergency responses gave new responsibilities to political or to apolitical bodies, actually, like the European Central Bank, that now has certain fiscal authorities that it didn't have before. So the decisions that were made in that situation and that were legitimized through the emergency narrative promoted the interest actually of certain groups. Then another point that we have to be aware of is the historic experience and the connotations that people have with emergencies. And this brings me also back to the German demand that I mentioned earlier, where the term emergency or Notzustand just has certain connotations in the German context. Notzustand means people are overcoming a democratic system and establish a dictatorial fascist system. This is the connotation that is there. We need to be very aware, especially in the Dutch context then where we're acting, what these connotations are. And then a last point is that when we talk about emergencies, it can very easily lead to confusion with the formal state of emergency as defined in the Dutch constitution or as defined in, for example, some international treaties. So basically, the emergency is defined by law. First of all, one thing that I want to say to it is that it's kind of a paradox. The emergency by definition is unpredicted. And still in many countries, like in the Netherlands, by law, we define how we are going to react to the unpredictable. So these emergency powers can also change. And if situations are changing, like if there is suddenly an understanding of an ecological crisis, we can also, maybe by law or through other processes, define how to react to these emergencies. And we don't have to stick to these ideas that we had, for example, in the Dutch case in the 90s. Still, there can be a lot of confusion with these formally defined emergencies, and we need to be aware of this when we choose a certain wording and also when we just argue for whatever demands we will decide on. Which brings me to the wording part. I just briefly want to mention this. It makes sense maybe to think more deeply about what exact wording we want to use in the demands. So I just wanted to put this up here, this just from Merriam-Webster, some definitions of emergency, and then also contrasted to this crisis, which there has been a lot of discussion in the Netherlands, whether to use the word emergency, Notzustand, or crisis. So it makes sense there maybe to just think about the definitions and the connotations that people have with these words. And then, of course, for the Dutch version, it even becomes more complicated because there are a lot of different words that can be used. Here it is important that, again, native Dutch speakers engage in the discussion. I can't give such a big comment on this because I don't know what connotations people have with these words. Because I ended now with all this criticism, I think it is very good to think about the benefits and the detriments of the emergency narrative, and also to see it in connection to the other demands. You can't see this in isolation because, for example, the Citizens' Assembly demand, basically the establishment of a democratic decision-making body, can already address a lot of the critique points on the emergency. So it is important not to see this emergency demand in isolation, but see its dependencies, interrelations with the other demands.